Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I chair the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Today, we are going to take a look at a disturbing topic, anti-Asian hate. On March 16th, 2020, President Trump first referred to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus. Shortly thereafter, terms like Kung flu and Wuhan virus began appearing on social media. Next, hate crimes against Asian Americans began to rise. Exactly 1 year after Trump's statement, the most notorious of these hate crimes took place in Atlanta, where a gunman shot 8 people, 6 of them Asian women. A month later, in a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center, 45% of Asian Americans reported experiencing at least one racially linked incident since the pandemic began. Yet it is important to understand that although the pandemic has brought national attention to anti-Asian sentiment, that sentiment is not new. Asians have experienced discrimination and violence since the California gold rush, if not before. In an effort to raise awareness about this troubling problem, Concerned Citizens has invited Russell Jeung, professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State, to share his experience with our viewers. Professor Jeung has 5 books and many articles to his credit. He is also known for his commitment to Christianity, which he interprets as demanding civic engagement. To meet that demand, he has worked tirelessly on behalf of a broad range of Asian immigrant groups, including peoples from Mongolia, Bhutan, Burma, Cambodia, and of course, China. Last year, he founded the organization Stop AAPI Hate. Professor Jeung is a 4th-generation Chinese American. He was raised in San Francisco and, like myself, graduated from Lowell High School. Unlike myself, he has a bachelor's from Stanford and a PhD from Berkeley. Welcome, Russell Jeung.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you for inviting me to Concerned Citizens. I'm really excited to be here, especially from a fellow alum from Lowell High. And like Sue introduced, last March, President Trump began to use the term Chinese virus on March 16th. That exact same week, on March 19th, we created Stop AAPI Hate, AAPI for Asian American and Pacific Islander. We recognize from history that whenever a disease came from Asia, Asians were often scapegoated and blamed for that disease, and then met with interpersonal violence and racist policies. So we wanted to track racism, and we created a website in multiple languages to receive reports from Asian Americans themselves. And we didn't know what to expect, how much racism Asian Americans were experiencing. And when we launched the site, we were immediately flooded with hundreds of incidents from across the nation, and they were actually harrowing. The hate and the anger directed towards Asians was palpable, and this really, for me, distressing, saddening. And so to give you a sense of what we're receiving on a regular basis, the surge continues in 2021. I'm going to have some of the members here read the incidents, and I invite you as the audience just to feel and experience what Asian Americans are going through at the moment. And these reports are all from the elderly, and you don't often think of Asian American senior citizens going online and complaining, but they are, because they know racism when they experience it, and they want it to stop. So I'll invite Nelson to start, and then each of you can read.
Okay, customer began screaming at me for no reason, well in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I'm mostly Chinese, and my family has been in St. Louis Obispo since the 1860s. I'm fourth generation in St. Louis Obispo, but I guess I will never be an American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and the back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit upon by a big white guy.
I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck with from behind video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with Chinese monkey, F you, Chinaman, go back to China, bringing the Chinese over here. 67 years of San Francisco, California.
On my
Grace?
daily
Oh, Alan, yes.
on my daily walk in my home, excuse me, on my daily walk in my hometown Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me fear and to be more alert of my surroundings.
Grace, would you like to read the next one? Maybe not. Well, okay, I'll read it. My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business. Two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then said, "You need to go back from where you came from." We were shocked to hear this.
I'll do the next one.
Okay.
Waiting to enter pharmacy to get prescription. Group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of me, faking, coughing, spitting, and made slant eyes. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and for the reason his father died. A mother came and put her hands on my arm, but she did not help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and how and to tell me to go home. But this is scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 10 years ago, Bakersfield, California.
As I was leaving the restaurant, a white male stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you effing Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to an officer who arrived later. I have not heard anything back yet from anyone.
Thank you. So as you can hear from these reports, there's a lot of profanity, a lot of yelling. What makes it even more difficult is when people around don't intervene and don't help, or when police don't respond. Through March this year, we received 6,600 incidents, and that number again continues unabated today. And you could see the 4 types of categories in terms of the racism that Asian Americans are experiencing. Here on the bottom, about 9% of the incidents involve civil rights violations, being mistreated at the workplace, not getting ride shares, being denied entry to businesses. 7% are online incidents, but it's probably a lot higher. We just did a youth survey, and over 80% of the youth say they see online racism, maybe not directly, but indirectly, and they know how people are making fun of or mistreating other Asians. Microaggressions, like you've heard, make up the large bulk. Verbal harassment or being avoided deliberately because you're Asian. Again, these aren't micro in the sense that they're small. We did a study of Stop AAPI hate respondents, and 1 out of 5 now display signs of racial trauma. That's long-term symptoms, 3 symptoms that are long-term, including anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, and avoidance. So I would argue these incidents are so traumatic, and because others are vicariously experiencing it, that we're now experiencing a generational case of racial trauma, collective racial trauma, that will have long-term impacts. They're also impactful because we're also getting assaulted at really high rates. 8% of the incidents involve people coughing and spitting on us. So my own wife was running and someone just blocked her path and coughed deliberately into her face. And people ask, how do you know racism has increased? And I would answer, I don't think people in 2019 were coughing and spitting on their neighbors, but they are, at relatively high rates today. Physical assaults make up about 30% of the cases, and I see Asians being pushed and shoved, have bottles and rocks thrown at them, and people try to run us over with their cars. So this happened so much in 2020. I wasn't surprised in 2021 to see Asian American elderly killed, in the Bay Area, in San Francisco and New York. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shootings. The trends have been really consistent. Vulnerable groups are attacked. Bullies attack those whom they think they can bully. So women are attacked twice as much as men, and youth and elderly are disproportionately represented. So then the question arises, why the surge in racism? Why attack Asians for a virus that's simply biological? And there's 3 key factors. The first is, as Sue mentioned, is the political rhetoric last year. Using the term and the insistence of the term Chinese virus really was deadly for Asian Americans. That term did 2 things. It racialized the virus so that the biological virus became Chinese, and it stigmatized the people so that Chinese and those who look Chinese were the ones seen to be the carriers. When people heard that term again and again, it became part of people's implicit bias. People began to make that association almost automatically. When they saw Asian people, they saw the virus. When they heard about the virus, they would think about Asian people. That connection of the virus with Chinese people was reinforced by media representations, especially on the internet and social media. So here, what happened was that the hate speech, that hate terminology, Chinese virus, went viral. People began to hear it and see it again and again, and that hate speech led to hate violence. On the right is an Instagram post of a party held at the University of Albany. Students were drinking Corona beer and had pictures of Chinese people with masks on around them. Some of the pictures had Chinese people with their eyes X'd out as if they died. And this is how American students are partying. This other post also went viral. It's a picture of a Chinese person eating bat, the supposed source of the disease. So when people see these representations over and over, it actually chemically hardwires in our brains. It's how our brain operates. It's part of our neuropsychology. Is that people make the association of the virus with Chinese and Chinese people with the virus. Because people were already afraid of during the pandemic, afraid of the virus, they would get triggered. They would feel threatened when they saw Asians, and they would automatically go into flight or fight mode, right? That's our stress response, fight or flight. And so the fight mode was people would attack us, harass us. The flight mode, people would shun us. We're not saying everybody's intentionally racist, but we're saying people are using racial lenses to profile Asians. Even I, early on, when I saw an Asian person wearing a mask, I would think and assume they're more likely to be infected than a non-Asian wearing the disease. That's just the way we get socialized racially. So the political rhetoric and the constant media representations really exacerbated the issue and made people afraid of Asians. This fear of Asians is part of a long historic fear, a stereotype called the yellow peril. This is a stereotype in the West that Asians would threaten the West with our hordes of people and with our disease-ridden bodies. The yellow peril was invoked time and time again to blame Asians for diseases and for being national security threats as well. I know if your generation right now might remember Fu Manchu. My grandfather actually moved to LA and Hollywood to play Fu Manchu in the movies. And that was sort of the human embodiment of the yellow peril. So to give you some historical incidents, in the 19th century, you can see in this picture, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen to emanate out of San Francisco Chinatown, to be specters of death. And again, Chinese were blamed for these diseases. Chinese were also blamed for stealing white workers' jobs. So that was the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. At the same time, anti-Chinese hysteria was so heightened that over 300 Chinese settlements were displaced during that period. These weren't individuals, but entire communities wholesale driven out by mob violence. My own great-grandparents, they moved or settled in Monterey, California in a fishing village. They were evicted, and when they wouldn't leave, a mysterious fire burned down the entire village of 200 people. The landlord then fenced off the area so Chinese couldn't return. They bulldozed the rest of the village into the Pacific. And so my great-grandparents, who had lived in Monterey for 4 decades, had built a family and a home. They had to move to San Francisco as the only refuge from racism at the time. History repeated itself in 1900 with the bubonic plague. It was found in San Francisco Chinatown, so health officials quarantined the area, segregated. They allowed whites to leave, but they kept Chinese there with ropes and barbed wire, presumably to get infected. At the same time, Honolulu and Santa Ana Chinatowns were burned down, leaving thousands homeless because bubonic plague was found there. So this San Francisco Chronicle article has the headline, "The bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. Disease comes, Asians get blamed, they face violence and racist policies." That continued at the Angel Island Immigration Center. If Asians were found to be unhealthy, they were detained longer, and if deemed medically unfit, they were deported back. 10% of the Asians who took that 3-week steamship journey to get to California never made it to San Francisco shores because they were deported back. Later on in the 1940s and 50s, tuberculosis was a major issue, and health officials actually quarantined families again. Both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, had kids with tuberculosis who had to be quarantined and separated from their parents for long periods. So because of health policy and because of race, my own family has faced exclusion, segregation, quarantine, detention, deportation, and long-term family separation. So you could see how history repeats itself with this yellow peril, fear. This is how Asians are racialized. We're racialized differently than Blacks. but we're racialized more often as either insiders to America or outsiders. The racialization means how we're perceived racially, how others view us. And, last year, I know Concerned Citizens is doing a series on Blacks in Laguna Woods. When George Floyd was killed, Asian Americans were thrown for an identity crisis because in that killing, there was an Asian American police officer holding back the crowds. Among American, Total was complicit with Derek Chauvin in the killing of George Floyd. So Asian Americans, we saw ourselves in that police officer. We couldn't distance ourselves from him. And so we had to wonder, are Asians complicit with whiteness and white supremacy, or are we really in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? And we didn't know where we fit in. Because the United States is mostly discussed in a white-Black racial binary, because politics and race relations and history is usually white and Black, Asians often feel invisible or omitted because we are neither white nor Black. So while we're sort of struggling about where we fit in, at that same time, we were being cast out of America, being perceived as professional foreigners who don't belong. Sometimes we're the insiders to America, we fit in, we're white adjacent as the model minority. But in times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese were interned, times of economic downturn, such as when Vincent Chin was killed, when auto workers mistook him for being Japanese and blamed him for being their layoffs. And in times of pandemic, Asians are not seen as insiders to America, but are outsiders who don't belong. That's why now we counted in about 2/3 of our incidents, people use rhetoric like, go back to China, you effing chink. People don't think that we belong to the nation or to their neighborhood, and that's why they're attacking us. It's not because we're model minorities and our grandmothers are so smart. It's because people don't see our grandmothers as belonging, as fitting in, and that's why we're getting attacked. So we're differently racialized than Blacks, but I think we both need to partner together with Black Lives Matter to dismantle the system that stereotypes us and treats us differently. You could see this racialization as insiders or outsiders in the way Asian American women are portrayed by popular media. This is the intersectional objectification of Asian American women, where both their race and gender lead to stereotypes. If Asian American women are seen as insiders, they're often portrayed as the China doll, quiet and submissive. But if they're considered outsiders, they're often portrayed as dragon ladies, threatening, hypersexualized, to be kept out. Either portrayal is an objectified way of portraying the women. And because they're seen as sex objects, it's easier then for men to fetishize them, and like the Atlanta shooter, target Asian businesses and then to shoot at them. So the racism against Asian Americans has been violent, it's been deadly, and it's had other serious impacts as well. In terms of our mental health, Asian Americans have the highest rates of mental health distress during the pandemic. And those who experience racism have higher stress, symptoms of stress and anxiety and depression. So here's a really scary fact. When asked what's their greatest stressor during the pandemic, Asians overwhelmingly said racism. They said they were more concerned about racism than the pandemic that's killed over 600,000 people. Right? Asian Americans are more concerned about other Americans' hate than they are than the pandemic. That's because we can protect ourselves against COVID-19 by wearing a mask, but we can't vaccinate ourselves from racism. We can't protect ourselves from some random person who pushes and shoves the elderly. And so because of that fear, we have high rates of anxiety and stress. Asian businesses have also been adversely affected by racism. People were avoiding Asian businesses because they thought they could get the disease there. And so those businesses closed down early, even before quarantines, and large swaths of the Asian American working class and service sector are now unemployed. We're the racial group with the highest unemployment rate after Blacks. And finally, I talked about how history repeats itself. A disease comes, Asians get blamed, they face violence, and they face racist policies. Last year, due to COVID-19, the administration banned Chinese scientists and researchers. He suspended migration visas so family couldn't reunite. He cut refugee settlement, and he cut H-1B visas to professional workers. All these policies disproportionately impacted Asians and excluded them from entering. Again, Asians were seen as threats, the yellow peril to be excluded for national security or for our public health. But history repeats itself in one last way. In all of these cases, when Asians faced discrimination, they always fought back. They weren't hapless victims to discrimination. And today, Asian Americans are fighting back again. Our youth are organizing, and you can see here, they've held rallies, and our youth have published their own policy reports that have actually gotten Representative Grace Meng to introduce legislation calling for ethnic studies. And they actually advocated for Superintendent of Schools, Tony Thurmond in California, to send a letter to every school district warning them about racial bullying. Famous Asian Americans have really spoken out. And through social media, we've alerted and sounded the alarm. And we've come together in rallies across the nation. Now, I said that people were threatened by Asians and going into fight or flight mode. And in the same way, I think Asians now are threatened by racism, and we're going into fight or flight mode as well. The fight mode is that Asians are arming themselves. They're giving them kids mace. They're calling for more policing. The flight mode is that Asian elderly are really physically isolating. I don't know any family that hasn't told their elders to stay inside. We're the racial group least likely to send our kids back to the classroom for fear of the pandemic and fear of racial bullying in the classroom. So Asians are, again, in a state of racial trauma in fight or flight mode. But there's one last response that I think is really adaptive. And beyond fight or flight, Asians are flocking. So Asians are flocking to grieve and provide solace to each other in vigils after the Atlanta shootings. We're flocking at these rallies to gain strength and support from other communities of color. We're flocking back to ethnic enclaves to chaperone our elders and to patronize Asian businesses. We're flocking at these groups like Concerned Citizens and really raising our voices. So I think that's been a really powerful and heartening movement for me, is that despite all the anger I feel about the racism and the sadness I feel about seniors, I'm really encouraged by the flocking of Asians and the strength and unity they've presented. This flocking, to conclude, has really made a difference. In just a year, we've seen that surge of racism, but the Asian American community has really responded quickly and has gotten government to intervene. Senate passed, the Congress passed a hate crime bill. President Biden has issued several executive orders. And just this month, this is what maybe the most historic response is that the API Legislative Caucus in California, they introduced the API Equity Bill signed by Governor Newsom. That gave $157 million to Asian American groups to fight racism. So because we have Asian American elected officials, because we have the community really sounding the alarm, I think California has become the model for the rest of the nation about how to respond and how to fight for racial justice. So I'll stop there. I'm really, again, thankful for groups like Concerned Citizens who are really informed and take action on these types of incidents. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. So, so now maybe some of our audience might like to ask some questions or simply make a comment.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question is that I'm very much concerned about the hate incident. But I'd like to know what kind of a minimum requirement, minimum amount of data needed to report a incident, okay? And should I collect this person's name or take a photo or I need a witness? I don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
I like to tell the Asian community people how to handle it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have multiple language. We have 15 languages now that people can report to. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a crime. It has to be any incidents where you perceive that you were mistreated or faced discrimination. And you don't need witnesses. It's just mostly people's self-reports. They type in what happened to them, where it happened, and maybe the type of discrimination, whether it was like verbal or if you were assaulted or were you mistreated. So you can also report for others. So we take witness accounts as well. Because what we're trying to do, we're trying to document what's happening and to understand the trends. We're not trying to necessarily, help every individual. We didn't have the capacity to do that. I think hopefully moving forward, now that we have more resources, we'll be able to help individuals as well, whether like if you want to take legal action. A lot of these cases you can get redressed through the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So nobody knows about this. Is when people face discrimination, like if you get yelled at and that stops you from being able to shop and buy something, that's a civil rights violation. You're not getting safe access to goods and services. So you could actually complain to the state government. They'll actually send an investigator. And if it's found to be valid, they could actually hold the corporation accountable and the business for not protecting you, or they could actually do a mediation between you and the individual or the store. And so there's a lot of protections that we don't know about. And so what we're doing is we're going through all our cases and then telling people, oh, we think you have a good case here. And we encourage people, we encourage you to report to the state then, and we'll give you a free attorney too.
Thank you.
Let me just try to clarify there. So I think what Dr. Maher is asking is sort of more generally. So if he or someone he knows experiences what they perceive to be a hate incident, if they were to report it to your organization, Stop AAPI Hate, I guess you do that through the internet?
Yes. So
Okay.
you go to stopaapihate.org. We then gather all the data, and what we do is we aggregate it to show what are the major trends to present to government. We don't help individuals necessarily, but maybe in the future we can help individual cases. But overall, it's to create more collective responses.
Well, supposing that the person does want to, I guess, I think part of what Dr. Maher is asking is under what conditions might it be more likely that some punitive action or some redress would be possible, because people don't want to just complain about something for the exercise of doing so. They're actually hopeful that something will come out of it if they're going to make a fuss. So so how might you know when you should make a fuss, and then how might you where should you fuss?
Right. So I think there's different levels of making a fuss. So if you make a fuss with Stop API Hate, that's actually effective, right? Because again, we could say there's been 10,000 cases. Now there's 20,000 cases. And so now, because people have made a fuss on the collective level, we have a strong voice. We were able to pass the API equity bill, right? We've been able to document that racism is occurring. On the individual level, I think you should make a fuss because first of all, it actually helps your mental health. If you don't make a fuss and report, people just sort of turn people get angry, right? You realize that was really wrong. And if you don't externalize it, if you don't share it, it just builds up inside you and you just sort of get resentful or angry. So it gives you a place to direct your frustration and emotional energy. So we actually found that people who report to Stop API Hate feel better afterwards. So that's the first reason to report a fuss, is it helps you express it in a good manner rather than, lashing out at your kid or something. If you want to get civil redress, again, we could help you identify whether it's worth taking that action and whether the state government could help you you could get financial redress if you face discrimination. So that's worth making a fuss. And then thirdly, if it's a crime, then you should report it because the police then track these types of incidents. And it's really important to identify how many criminal actions occur. So I would say like 90%, maybe at least half are civil actions that people could take individual action on and actually get redress. And maybe only a small sliver are actual criminal actions that you could actually make a fuss and get any redress on. But make a fuss. It's just good to make a fuss in general.
Grace?
Let me, make sure I'm unmuted. Yes, I think it's wonderful that we have this bill passed about fighting the hate crime. But I think this racism problem usually is because we don't have understanding of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps we could, I was just wonder if there are any programs or projects that's funded to say educate in school system or any kind of forum or something about what Asians are, where they come from, and what they're doing, and what their contribution, their history, and just like the Black and the other minorities are trying to do, so that the whole country will realize, this is not yellow something, and they're just people coming here because they like it here and they want to contribute. And there are many Asians are very well accomplished and they contribute a lot to the society. And I think if we all understand each other and where we're coming from, where we're going, and that would be great. And so we need programs to do that. And of course, having a program like you're saying, and recording what people have reported and take some action about it. But we simultaneously, we can also have these other kind of educational program going on and in the society or in the school. And that would be great. Thank you, Dr. Chung.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's a great recommendation. That's my top recommendation as well, as we want to prevent the racism right before it occurs, before we have to report. And for me, that requires educating our young people and to learn how to get along with each other, to learn the history of each group. And I think as we understand each other, then we empathize and don't mistreat each other. So we've been really pushing ethnic studies. We know that we could try to require it at different sites. So Illinois and Connecticut just passed statewide requirements for Asian American studies. So we could promote the requiring of this type of curriculum. We also need to better develop curriculum about Asian Americans. So UCLA is developing a large curriculum project that we want to support. And thirdly, we need teacher training. So we are also promoting that teachers become more educated themselves about different racial groups. And so all those recommendations are one of our top priorities for Stop API Hate. And that's what we're going to try to do, I think, nationwide, is try to promote ethnic studies across the country.
Well, I am going to push the envelope a little bit here. So we know also, however, that there's a phenomenon going on in the country right now about critical race theory. So perhaps you, as somebody in this area, could speak a little bit to what is critical race theory and what and how might it be related and how might it not be related to enhancing our curriculum in terms of Asian American history.
Right. I think so. Critical race theory is really similar to ethnic studies. So ethnic studies and critical race studies take the same approach, which is to provide the history and the understandings of race from the perspectives of people of color. Now, the opponents of critical race theory say that we're saying that every white is racist and institutions are all racist. And I don't think they clearly understand what critical race theory is. So the critique of it, the challenge of it may be misguided. And so we think critical race theory and ethnic studies is simply what Grace was recommending. Let's understand the contributions of every group. Let's understand the backgrounds of every group. Let's understand why some groups face racism so that we could have better race relations. And I think we're sort of all in for that. I think, people are challenging critical race studies and ethnic studies, but at the same time, other states are passing ethnic studies because it seems like people don't really understand what we teach. And I think, again, what we teach is really positive. It's really helpful. It's an understanding of American history and American race relations to improve it. And I think it's sorely needed now. You can see it because our nation's so polarized, right? And so we need to learn how to get along and how to discuss with each other in a civil way. So it's a good question. Why do some people challenge critical race theory when I think most people are for promoting equality and justice, and critical race theory isn't saying every individual is racist. I think a lot of us have racial biases, but we're not. I think, we just needed to clear up the air of what we're teaching to our students. And I think most people would be in favor of it.
Right, thank you. Okay, other thoughts or questions? Alan, you have to unmute
Alan,
yourself.
you have to mute, yeah.
Alan?
Yep. Okay. Something that I wasn't aware of until I started listening to people is that people who have been discriminated against, or members of groups who have historically been discriminated against, they literally live their lives differently than many of us do. Many of us who aren't of those groups, they have to take different things, or they do take different things into consideration in just living their day-to-day life. I mean, things like where you go, what you're willing to expose yourself to, even what time you leave the house. And I think that people really aren't aware of the physical, mental, and emotional toll that this takes on people. And I guess I'd be interested in addressing what you feel, or if your research has shown anything as to what the long-term effects are on people of this kind of thing. It kind of puts you in a permanent state of heightened fear, or just watching all around you, or do you ever recede back to normalcy? Let's put it like that.
Yeah, it is really troubling. I just heard one of my high school friends came back, and I asked about his parents who are in their 90s, and he said they're not leaving their home anymore unless they're accompanied by their kids, right? And it's just like facing physical segregation again. That just like my great grandparents had to retreat to San Francisco Chinatown for fear of racism, I think elderly in urban areas have confined life spaces, we call them life spaces, the amount of space that you could feel free to move about in. And people are now confined to like 2-room apartments, and that impacts their mental health because they're anxious and fearful, but it really impacts their physical health, right? Because they're not getting exercise. Some people aren't even going out to shop anymore. And so we're trying to promote chaperone services to get people out, group walks to help the elderly move about and to get exercise. But it is really concerning. We're going to do a study with UCSF to find out how limited Asian American elderly are at the moment. But you're right, it's taking a toll, especially among our senior citizens, about how concerned they are, how anxious they are, and how confined they are now. And then for the young people, people always feel that.
Sorry.
But I would, coming from a country which is a melting pot of all races, I can see the problems, but the best thing is education. To educate the people, look, we are all human. One race, that's human. What's the problem? You know, this is what we should approach the country. That, you know, if I'm an Asian, if I'm a Middle Eastern, we are all human beings. We are all brothers and sisters. We should respect each other. We should help each other.
Mm.
That's my understanding.
Okay, other comments?
I just want to share a very interesting story with you. Because of when people questioning Chinese say, why you come to America? I always joke with them. I say, well, since I had a 23andMe genetic test, and they told me that American Indian is my distant relative. So I joke with them, say, hey, my relative come to America before even you come to America. So I belong to here. Even though it's a joke, but it's a fact. If you have taken this genetic test, you'll find out the Chinese is related to American Indian.
Sure.
It's true. So
yeah.
Okay, I have then a couple more questions, if no one else wants to comment. I would be interested in a little bit in information that your organization may have collected about perpetrators. Let's shift a little bit from the victims to the perpetrators. I say that partly because here we live, we are 20% Asian in Laguna Woods, where we're broadcasting from. And most of us are over 55. Some of us are well over 55. And that's not perhaps quite the real world. We're not exposed to the real world here. Oh, of course we do. We do go out, maybe, as Alan is saying, we may be going out somewhat less than we used to, particularly if we're Asian. So in terms of the kinds of people who perpetrate these indignities and atrocities, I would wonder a little bit about their age, their gender, their are they all white or some of them not? What are they? What about geography? I was also wondering, are places, is this more likely to crop up where the Asian population is large or small? So are they rural or urban? What can you tell us about them, Professor Jeung?
Oh, that's a great sociological question. So
Well, I'm a sociologist.
yeah, we don't really track perpetrator data, so we can't say definitively this is representative. But I think the perpetrators come from all racial backgrounds. They sort of seem to reflect the U.S. So again, we don't ask for what was the race or ethnicity of the perpetrator. We only get it when they say, oh, a white person attacked me or a black person attacked me. So we don't have full data, but it seems like there's no one racial profile of who are the perpetrators. And what we've noticed is that there's a lot of actually gang bullying. So sadly, it's often 2 or 3 people. When people are in groups, they feel more emboldened to harass or to pick on others. A lot of times in the youth incidents, there's a lot of bystanders around who don't intervene. We have that type of incidental reporting. But and then where it comes from, we get higher reports where Asian Americans reside. So it's a self-select sample, I think, of Americans are reporting from the coast. New York City actually has the highest rate. So it's sort of surprising to me because we're sort of California based, but I guess it happens so much in New York City, and then San Francisco is second. What we want to do eventually is to sort of like map out the racism and see, are there any corresponding factors to the racism? Like, is it high rates of unemployment or high rates of crime or high rates of Christian nationalists, high rates of new immigrants? So we'll do that eventually to do what we call heat maps of racism. Those are really good questions about.
What about age?
It's hard. They
Are
don't
older
say.
people are bullies? Oh, you don't know. Okay, right. I mean, it would just seem to me that my perspective would predict that it's younger people are much more likely to engage in these kinds of activity, bullying and so forth, than older people are. I'm not saying older people don't. I'm just saying that the proportion might be higher, and males. Well, I thought it was really interesting. You told us that the victims are disproportionately female, and I'm wondering, and the perpetrators are probably disproportionately male. I'm just guessing that.
Yeah, probably. I think it's just like women harassment, that it's usually in public spaces, and men harass women in general, and they're using COVID-19 to harass. Yeah. Okay, I have to go now, but I like to thank concerned citizens for inviting me. This is really fun. I don't know. I really enjoyed speaking with each of you, and we'll hope to be able to meet and talk to you again soon.
Okay, you go ahead and sign off, and I'm still going to conclude.
Thank you, Russell.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just conclude. I'm sorry he's had to leave, but I do want to share with our listeners and viewers the following. We thank Russell Jeung for taking time out to speak to us. I tried to count the number of YouTube videos featuring Professor Jeung that were recorded in the past year. I stopped counting after 30. So thanking him, we thank him so much for being willing to talk to us about this disturbing period in Asian American history. And we thank you, our audience, for watching this program. Concerned Citizens looks forward to bringing you another thoughtful broadcast next time.